Okay, a little bit of history of Western logic. Classical logic is something of a misnomer because it has absolutely nothing to do with the great classical civilizations of the West, like Egypt and Greece and Rome. Classical logic essentially was invented at the end of the 19th century, and the most important person here was Gottlob Frege, who I think did not get the credit he deserved initially. So when these new ideas were taken up in Europe and other European-derived countries like North America and Australia, the people who got the credit were, in the first instance, people like Russell, sometimes Wittgenstein, and it wasn't really till the mid-50s that people recognised how much was owed to Frege.
Even though Russell at least made it quite clear that he was drawing on Frege, didn't he?
Oh yes, yeah, he didn't hide this, but people read Principia, that's Russell's 1910 book, where he deployed what was essentially something like Frege logic. So people read that, and they didn't go back and read Frege. One reason they didn't was because Frege's notation is terrible. It's really hard to read, whereas Russell's symbolism looked much more familiar to mathematicians. Anyway, the point was that classical logic is an invention of the late 19th century. I don't know who coined the term classical logic, but it's a masterstroke of propaganda because it makes you think how cool it is. It's been around since ancient Greece. No, this is just not true. So logic has developed in the West for 2,500 years, and logic, as modern logicians understand it, is a theory about what follows from what. So if I give you certain things, claims that I make, what can I infer from that? That's what logic deals with. And different theories of that have been proposed since ancient Greece through the great medieval period into the end of the 19th, 20th, 21st century. So logic is a very dynamic subject which has evolved over a long period of time. Unfortunately, the way that logic is taught nowadays is anything but historical. So you're just given a logic book and you're told this is logic, and it's probably some form of classical logic. So you can get the impression that this has, dropped from the sky. Or, maybe some kind of Moses has brought it down from Mount Sinai, and you just learn the tablets.
It's more like learning physics nowadays than it is like learning, say, ethics.
Yeah, except that most physicists, or most people who learn physics, know that physics has a history. Most logic students don't know that logic has a history. It's taught very ahistorically. Okay, that's a bit of a gripe. Okay, set that aside. So it's important to see that classical logic is a product of its time, and it was a fantastic advance in logic. Classical logic was so much more powerful than anything that had preceded it that it soon became, in 20 or 30 years, fairly orthodox. And there are many great investigations of it by brilliant mathematicians such as Hilbert and, of course, Gödel. So Hilbert's working in Göttingen in the 1920s, 1910. Gödel is working in Vienna in 1920s, 1930s, before he goes to the US and works in Princeton. So these are great logicians. And what they were able to do was develop the logic that had been invented by people like Frege and show so much of its wealth. And philosophers caught on, and they thought, hey, we've got this great new philosophical tool, let's do everything we can with it. So the next 30 years of philosophy, from about 1920 to 1960, is philosophers who want to apply logic, take logic as the tool and try to apply it to philosophy of science, philosophy of language, thinking, finally we've got logic right, now we can go about applying it.
This is sort of the heyday of analytic philosophy, you might say.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Or certainly you have developments like logical positivism.
Yeah, it's very much connected with logical positivism, logical empiricism in the United States. But when you start to use a tool, one thing that you quickly discover is its limitations. Well, quickly, it takes 40, 50 years in this case. And it's clear that classical logic has limitations. Now, all logicians are aware of this. You might think that there are ways of a workaround of the limitations, okay? But you might come to think that there are better ways of approaching logic, that you don't need a workaround. What you need is a kind of revamping of logic. So what we've seen, especially in the last 40 years, I guess, but actually it goes back way before that, is people working on systems of logic which are now called non-classical logic. So these are logics which deviate from classical logic in some way or other. And roughly speaking, deviant logics, non-classical logics, fall into two kinds. The ones that think that the expressive resources of classical logic are too limited. So you add extra expressive machinery. And the sort of paradigm example of that is modal logic, where you add a logic to deal with things, claims about possibility, necessity, and so on. And in the 20th century, that goes back to C.I. Lewis, who's working in the 1920s. But then there are people who say, no, classical logic gets it wrong in a much more profound way. There are just things about there are just things about classical logic which are just wrong. And that movement starts very early. So probably the first person to work on this area was the Dutch mathematician Brouwer, who's working on something called intuitionist logic, really about 1910, so about the same time as Principia Mathematica. And then by about the 1920s, you get another Dutch mathematician, Arend Heiting, producing intuitionist logic, which says, hey, classical logic is wrong. So I won't go into all the differences because they get technical, but in classical logic, there's a principle called the principle of excluded middle. So every statement is either true or false. And what intuitionists did was say, no, that's not true. There are some things which are neither true nor false. So they constructed a system of logic in which that is not a logical truth. So for every A, or it's not the case that A, is just not true. So the origins of non-classical logic really go back very close to the origins of classical logic, except no one paid much attention to them. Just because classical logic was such a fabulous theory, it's so powerful, it did such a good job of so many things, people didn't worry about the places where it didn't seem to fit so well. But by about the 1960s, 1970s, then lots of logicians started to feel, well, we shouldn't ignore these non-classical systems because maybe they can actually do a lot better job of some areas where classical logic seems to, it's like a pair of shoes that bite. You can live with the biting shoes for a while, but after a while you think, well, maybe I can do better with a new pair of shoes.
Does the classical logician think that this idea that a statement could be neither true nor false, I mean, in a way, that's an obvious observation. We actually talked about it in the Nagarjuna episodes, that, for example, category mistakes.
Right.
Like, how heavy is the color blue? This kind of question. I mean, there's no good answer to that, and the reason is because the question makes a false assumption, namely that colors have weight. Yeah. But couldn't a classical logician say, well, I don't need this other truth value because if I'm just precise enough and I avoid category mistakes?
Absolutely. So what some logicians have suggested that category mistakes require a non-classical logic where you have the value true, the value false, and then some value meaning a category mistake or something like this. What many classical logicians will tell you about that is, well, we're assuming that we're using a language where all the category mistakes have been factored out in the first place, so we can just ignore those. So I don't think that's been a particularly tough challenge for classical logic. There are many tougher challenges. So one of the earliest challenges was intuitionism, and this was driven by developments in the philosophy of mathematics. So Brouwer said, look, what's truth in mathematics? So truth in physics is kind of, well, there's a real world out there. What's true and what's false, it doesn't really depend on us. That's contentious view, of course, but certainly truth about the natural world is fixed because, hey, the natural world is out there. What about mathematics? Okay, you can think that the mathematical world is out there, like the natural world, and some philosophers do, but some think that, hey, that's just a kind of mysticism. Okay. So if mathematical truth is not sort of constituted by reality that's out there, what does constitute mathematical truth? And Brouwer said, well, what constitutes mathematical truth is provability. So to be true in mathematics is to be provable. Right. Now, there are lots of places in mathematics where you can't prove something. You can't prove A, for example, and you can't prove its negation. You can't prove that it's true. You can't prove that it's false. And in these cases, said Brouwer, okay, you cannot apply the principle excluding middle, at least until you got a proof of one of these guys.
Can't you even sometimes prove that you can't prove either A or its converse?
You can certainly prove that there are certain systems of logic where some things can either be proved or refuted. So this is a standard interpretation of one of their great theorems of Gödel, or the theorems of Great Gödel. But Brouwer was talking about not provability with respect to some system or other. He was talking about provability, period.
Oh, okay.
And Brouwer himself had a very jaundiced view of formal systems. He thought that proof is about mental constructions which may not be able to be captured in any one given formal system. So this is one of the early challenges to classical logic, and it depends on a sort of verificationist theory of truth. And of course, there's a lot to argue about there, but it's an illustration of one of the reasons that logicians have come to challenge classical logic. I mean, classical logic was very much orthodox up to about the 1960s. Then a number of people started to worry about it. I think it's probably fair to say that it's still the orthodox view, especially in philosophy. But I think that logic's in a very exciting state at the moment, because a lot of logicians have come to realise there are all kinds of ways in which we may not have got it right, and we really need to think about these things very carefully. So even if there is an orthodoxy, then we're not as sure that the orthodoxy is right as we were, say, 50 years ago. So it's a very exciting time.